Hello and welcome to the channel, and welcome to another episode of Tone Chasing, the series where we attempt to sound like some of our favourite guitarists on a budget. In today's video we're going to be attempting to sound like the guitarist from another one of my favourite bands, that being Simon Neil from Biffy Clyro. Now just before we get into it, I do want to say that this one was a challenge, both in terms of getting a tone that was fairly close and in terms of the playing. Simon is a great guitarist but has a very different style to me, and he also has quite a complicated and not to mention expensive rig, so matching it on a budget was hard. But let's get into it. So obviously Simon is a Strat player and is rarely ever seen playing anything that isn't a Strat. So the obvious choice is a Fender Strat. This is a Mexican standard series, although for the sake of the video, in the price I will include the price of the Player series, which is the current equivalent. But in terms of the guitar, it's a Strat, fairly standard. It's with the amp and the pedals where it starts to get interesting. So we'll talk about the amp next. So for those of you familiar with Simon's rig, you'll know that he uses two amps in tandem, those being, I believe, a Fender Bassman as well as a Marshall Plexi. Now obviously on the £1,500 budget that we aim to stick to in this series, we can't afford two amps, or at least not those two specific amps. So what I instead have done is I've just gone for the Marshall Plexi. The one I've got here is the SV20H, which is the 20 watt studio vintage version of the Plexi. This amp has two individual inputs for each of its channels, which is important, but we'll get to that in a minute. Moving on to the pedals. Now, Simon is pretty well known for using the Boss Metal Zone, so that's the obvious choice really here for the distortion. So we've got the Metal Zone, and then we've got what I think is the unsung hero really of this rig, that being the Fender ABY pedal. Now really any ABY pedal would do the job here, but I had the Fender one to hand, so this is what I'm using. Now the reason I'm using this pedal is really because of the 2 amp thing. So my guitar is running into the ABY, that is then duplicating my signal and sending one half of that through the Metal Zone and then into one channel of the Marshall, and then the other signal is coming out of here just clean and going into the Marshall. So what that's giving us really is one channel distorted and one channel relatively clean, which I found does a pretty good job of replicating the sort of tones that Simon gets out of just one amp. So I'll run you through some tones quickly. So side A of the ABY pedal is running through the Metal Zone and then into the normal channel on the Marshall. With the Metal Zone disengaged, it sounds something like this. And with the Metal Zone engaged, it sounds something like this. So I did use the Metal Zone just on its own for a little bit, for parts such as the start of Wolves of Winter. Sounds something like this. And then switching over to side B of the ABY, that is running straight from the guitar and into the high treble channel on the Marshall, and that sounds something like this. So as you can hear, it's not completely clean, although I've found that when you need a cleaner section, rolling off the tone and a little bit of the volume gets it cleaner and gets you more in that territory. I used this for example on the start of North of No South. Rolled the tone back to about 5 and just took a slight touch off the volume, and that gives you something like this. And then when you put that all together, it sounds something like this. So I think that's a pretty good ballpark Biffy tone. As is always with these videos, I'm going for a sort of rig that you could potentially go out and gig in, say, a cover band, something like that. But I think that gets us pretty close, and I think it's a pretty good little rig considering it doesn't cost thousands of pounds like Simon's real rig does. So that's a look at the rig, so now let's see how it sounds.